Good afternoon. Welcome to another edition of Professor Speaks. My name is Alex Hernandez. Alongside me is Dr. Craig Stern. I hope you had a great 4th of July holiday. And today we're going to be talking about antibiotic and antibiotic drug resistance. Um, a brief background about antibiotics is they have been used for over 70 years to treat patients with infectious diseases. So, though these drugs have greatly reduced illness and death from infectious diseases, we these drugs have been used so widely that we're starting to become immune to or the I'm sorry,
Resistant,
the drugs are actually not being
effective.
effective. Actually, that's what I want to say. Sorry about that. Matter of fact, let me just have Dr. Craig Stern help me with this. What is antibiotics and antibiotic drug resistance?
Yeah, I think you're right in something, Alex, and that is you put it into context. So let's put it into a larger context. The big picture here is that we have been using drugs since the 1980s, antibiotics specifically, and we use them over and over and over for the same thing. In many cases, this whole issue in general is something that happened because of the healthcare team. We got used to using drugs empirically, which means that we didn't always get a culture for what we were treating. We knew based on the location in the body and the symptoms of a particular problem that it could be treated with a particular drug. And so we continued to use that drug. Well, what happened over time was that the bugs saw that drug over and over and over. And as a result of that, began to develop genetic resistance to those drugs. As a result of that, they don't work. So that's the big picture. The little picture here is gonorrhea. Gonorrhea is a sexually transmitted disease. There's over 800,000 cases in the United States alone every year. So it's not a trivial problem. Probably a quarter of those cases, people don't even know that they have the problem. And then they have to deal with the consequences of it. And so in that particular case, you're correct. We have been treating gonorrhea and other infectious diseases, but specifically gonorrhea for decades. And the issue is that we used one group of therapy in one decade, another therapy in a second decade, a third in a third decade. Why is it a big deal now? We're running out of options. The manufacturing process has not come up with new drugs to deal with it. Older drugs that were effective no longer are effective. So effectively, we have two main problems. One is developing new drugs to be able to treat it, which we'll talk about more. And second, trying to come up with new ways to take old drugs to protect them from the bacteria, protect them from what the resistance is, get them to the site and allow them to be killed. So one's a delivery mechanism, and the other one is new drugs.
You had mentioned that there are no new options for fighting this disease. What has slowed the process down? Are we waiting to see signs of immunity before and then after trying to find solutions to the problem, or is there a way to combat it before it happens?
The problem that we have is that the antibiotics that really were created in a very major way in the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s were very effective.
Right.
In many cases, they are broad spectrum drugs that kill a lot of different bugs at the same time, and certain of them were very effective against gonorrhea.
Right.
Other sexually transmitted diseases were also treated with very common drugs. Penicillin was the first one,
Right.
after some of the strep drugs, etc. But what happened is that they were so effective, the manufacturers stopped making antibiotics. Furthermore, in the case specifically of gonorrhea, we've moved from one is a very effective drug and that'll kill it, and then trying another very effective drug and that will kill it, to a third very effective drug. Now we're into a combination of drugs to deal with it.
Right.
But even with that combination, we're running out of effectiveness even with the combination. So we're caught in the fact that we know that if the culture and if the identification is Neisseria gonorrhea, which is the organism,
Mhm.
and we know that there's a drug that will treat it. Unfortunately, the more that we use it, the less effective it becomes, and that's the problem for it.
Right.
In other cases, we have used what I originally talked about was empiric therapy, which meant that based on the location of the infection, based on symptoms, we had a very good idea of what the diagnosis was. We had some major antibiotics that effectively killed everything, not just that organism, but killed everything. And so as a result of that, we have become cases where the antibiotics are not effective because we use the shotgun approach versus the individual approach. Well, in the case of Neisseria gonorrhea, every time we had an effective drug, over a decade, it became less effective and less effective. We tried a different drug, a different drug, and a different drug, and now we're just running out of options.
Hmm. Okay, well, moving on with the subject, what are superbugs? We hear it all the time. We hear it in headlines. You know, they want to attract attention to a superbug, and it sounds bad. But what is it exactly?
Yeah, superbugs, in a very general sense, are bacteria that are common kind of things, streptomyces and staphylococcus, which are very common. They're even on your skin, and
Mhm.
they're not pathogenic, meaning they don't create disease just being on your skin.
Right.
But what happens is that there are forms of these that are very pathogenic, that can cause disease. And because of the bacteria and the antibiotics that we're doing, we're killing everything. So as a result of that, we have these little clones that grow up, and these little clones are these very specific bacteria that are part of the streptomyces and staphylococcus, and in this case, some of the sexually transmitted diseases like Neisseria gonorrhea. And they become much more pathogenic. They can create more disease. These are the superbugs. And the problem is that while certain antibiotics can kill 2/3 or 75% of most of these bacteria, with the superbugs, less percentage of them can be killed with these antibiotics. So they become superbugs because they're so hard to treat, and in many cases can't be treated at all.
It's a scary situation. We just going back to what you had mentioned before about that drugs like penicillin have become so effective that manufacturers end up just stop making them. How can we avoid that type of situation where drug manufacturers stop making antibiotic that they know is probably not going to work in the future?
Well, there's kind of two directions
Mm-hmm.
of concern right now.
Mm-hmm.
One is some therapy becomes so effective that people don't make anything more in order to deal with it. A current example is, for example, hepatitis C.
Mm-hmm.
Hepatitis C has no particular vaccine to prevent it, but it does have drugs that will treat it over the last 5 or 7 years. And these drugs have come on board, and they effectively kill most of the hepatitis C. So while there's a few new drugs that have come out, with the major part of them coming out over the last 5 years, there's less and less interest because these drugs, in fact, work.
Hmm.
So now the question is, as things go on and there's a sequence and people become resistant or these things tend not to work over time, then you have to get the pharmaceutical industry involved. To one extent, the federal government through the National Institute of Health and Centers for Disease Control are harbingers. They're big kind of selective forecasters
Mm-hmm.
that are saying, hey, there's a problem. We need to do it in our local labs, and then motivate the private labs, or motivate the private labs to start looking for other options to deal with it. Second issue is that a lot of these drugs still work, but they're broken down right away as soon as the bacteria sees them. So for example, and only as an example, penicillin was an enormously good drug in order to treat influenza. it effectively doesn't work as much anymore because there's so much resistance to penicillin. However, there are mechanisms that are going on today where people are looking at lipid envelopes or things to encapsulate the drug so that when you give it, it gets past the bacterial wall
Mm-hmm.
that says this is going to be a problem and gets directly to where the infection is and allows it to be treated. That works sometimes. It doesn't work all the time. New drugs obviously have to be tested in order to deal with it. And our goal is we're always playing catch up rather than playing for the new team.
Right.
We're always trying to deal with, well, there's already resistance. How do we develop something new in order to deal with it? Playing catch up means it's going to take longer. It's going to take more time. And effectively, as people now are getting older and the bacteria have seen these things over time, so more and more we're going to have this problem. We're going to be in a constant state of building new drugs, new antibiotics to treat things that previously
Right.
were treated.
Okay. Last but not least, what can we do to improve this situation that we're in with antibiotics and the drug resistance to them?
Yeah, it's important you bring that up. I've asked for our staff to put links on this talk
Mm-hmm.
to the Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organization, and they have fact sheets to tell people what to do and have common kind of prevention mechanisms, etc. In a very general way, the first thing is to educate people so that they're aware. Two is if it's preventable, certainly they want to try and prevent it. So for example, with Neisseria gonorrhea, it's important to take appropriate preventive steps to try and prevent these kind of problems, whether it's condoms or other things, or watching the kind of sexual intercourse that is there in order to deal with it. Easier said than done, but still you have to educate people in order to address it. Third thing is to motivate the population to understand that they have to not only be aware of and educated, but also report these things so that the body of data grows. And now with social media, it's easier to get more information from people about what's going on so that the Centers for Disease Control and in other parts of the world can deal with it. The other part of this that is kind of complicated is that in other parts of the world, because this is a worldwide problem, it's not just a US problem.
Right.
In other parts of the world and also in several parts of the United States that are not, there are poor, more indigent populations, the labs don't have the ability in order to do the testing in order to identify whether a bug is resistant or not. So we need to find better ways, not just to treat it, but also to get the laboratory mechanism to these areas and to do it faster so that we can identify what these problems are, identify where it's happening, how it's happening, and get that information back so that appropriate population preventive measures can go on while we're also trying to educate the population as a whole.
That's great information, and we can obviously go on and on about this topic, but that's all the time we have for today. We would like you to please visit RxInfoX on ProPharmaConsultants.com. Also, please visit the links that we'll put in the description for the CDC and also the World Health Organization, and where you can find information about how to combat these diseases and how to prevent them, more importantly. And please like, share, and subscribe, and we'll have new videos every Wednesday at noon. And see you next week.
And let me add one thing. We've written about this topic. It's called antibiotic stewardship, which is an approach to trying to, excuse me for interrupting, Alex, but I want to make sure we deal with it, to dealing with this. It has largely been a hospital-based measure for antibiotic stewardship, but now we've also written about it to be more community-oriented. So feel free, we'll put a link to the article up on our webpage so that you can easily see it. It's written a lot for technical things, but you can also look to see the site and the diagnosis to get an idea of the kind of therapy and what is a sequence of therapy. So you're not always using the same thing, so that you can sequence between step 1, step 2, step 3, etc.
We'll have the link on the webpage and also in the description. Okay.
Sure.
Got everything?
That's it.
All
That's
right.
it. Thanks so much.
All right. We'll see you guys next week.
Have a great day.